How far can regulation go in shaping national cyber resilience in a world of global supply chains and fast-moving technology? What can the UK learn from international approaches to managing systemic cyber risk? Cyber regulation should not be simply about setting minimum standards. It is a lever that shapes the future in a period of significant uncertainty. It protects the services and suppliers our economy relies on, and it enables agility against new threats and safeguards public trust. The decisions we take now will define our national resilience and competitiveness for the next decade. A recent report said that over 1/3 of leaders working across the UK's 13 CNI sectors cited regulatory requirements as the primary influence on their security programmes. In the UK, the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill is all about modernising how we protect the systems and the services that our country depends upon. In the European Union, the NIS2 directive raises the baseline level of cybersecurity by expanding the sectors in scope, by strengthening reporting requirements and increasing expectations around risk management. And in Australia, reforms to the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act broaden obligations on essential services to manage risk, report incidents, and, in extreme circumstances, permit government intervention. Across all of these regimes, one message is consistent. Cybersecurity is fundamental to national resilience and our national security. But do these regulations go far enough? Do they go too far? How do we manage foreign ownership in essential services and supply chains? How do we manage concentration risk in a small number of really key providers? How does regulation, and indeed how do regulators, adapt at the speed of technology change? These are all questions that we're going to look to cover over the next 50 minutes. So without further ado, please welcome to the stage my brilliant panel.
Hi, Jonathan.
So I'm delighted to be joined today by Rita Erfurt, the Assistant Director General of Global Powers and Counter Cybercrime at the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, ACSC, Claudia Plattner, the President of Germany's Federal Office of Information Security, BSI, the country's cybersecurity authority, Rod Latham, who's Director of Cybersecurity and Digital Identity at the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, DCIT, who are the department with lead policy responsibility for the incoming Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, and Natalie Black, who's Group Director for Networks and Communications at Ofcom, who lead regulation of the UK's telecoms and network infrastructure. Welcome. To begin with, I thought we could explore how different governments are approaching the challenges of cyber regulation and how we strive to achieve the right balance between security and economic impact. And so, Rod, I wondered if I could come to you first. The CSRB expands regulation to new sectors, it strengthens powers, but I'm interested in if you could talk to how DCIT have tried to balance managing the burden that cyber incidents have on our economy as a whole, the burden that they have on the taxpayer when they're successful, with the burden imposed on individual businesses by regulation.
Thanks, John. So I'm from, as John says, the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, and we are quite proudly consider ourselves both a prosperity department and a security department. And so my starting point on answering your question would be, we did some work that looked at the economic cost to the UK economy of cyber attacks. And our estimate is about £14.7 billion a year. It's about 0.5% of GDP. That's probably an underestimate. So that in itself is a kind of matter of national security where you have something that is doing, forget kind of almost about CNI for a moment. That in itself is a matter of national security that is happening. And that level of economic cost is unacceptable. So clearly, driving up security here is a prosperity issue. And I think that the CEO of Scottish Power just now put that well in terms of, there isn't always that competition between growth and security. Then when it comes to what do we do about that, regulation has a clear role. It is our kind of hardest lever, and that's why we've been introducing the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill into Parliament. It's been 8 years since NIS came into UK law. That's a long time in cybersecurity. A lot has changed, and we need to, as you say, modernise what we're doing. In terms of then how you then find the right balance between driving up security practice and managing the burden for business, I think the first thing I'd say is a bit of co-creation. And it's in the bloodstream of how we do things, is consultation, putting out proposals, getting feedback from affected industries, and then trying to work out where the proportionate line lies. That doesn't mean that everyone's always going to agree with where you draw the line, but you're doing it in an informed way with those who have been affected. And I think the reality is that we have seen a growth in what can be critical infrastructure. We designated data centers a couple of years ago, and this is our means of bringing them into scope. So I think part of what the CSRB is doing is driving up standards, but part of it is also expanding who is covered by that, because it feels now that we're in a world where that hard lever is more proportionate. But it's not the only thing, obviously, that we would do.
Thank you. And Claudia, perhaps I can come to you next. I'm always struck when we talk the difference in scope around the regulations in the EU and in Germany and what we're proposing in the UK system. So I'm interested in just how you perceive that balance to be, why Germany perceives that to be the right scope in terms of cyber regulation, and how you manage those kinds of costs and burdens on the economy versus burdens on business.
Indeed, it's a very, very tough balance to strike. So, and no matter how you do it, there's always going to be one side that's against you. So you get beaten up for it anyhow. So that's kind of a consolation. So you never could get it right in the first place anyhow. But on a little bit more serious side, regulation, as far as I'm concerned, and I think this holds for the rest of the government of Germany as well, is for all of us. Regulation is always the last resort. It always has to be the last resort. If you can, you want to have, market powers at play. As long as it's in the interest of society, go at it, because that's the way it's supposed to be. But we find ourselves in a situation where it's unfortunately not individual tough luck if you get hit as a company or as a public institution. It has grown out of this microeconomic scale into a macroeconomic scale. So we're talking about a situation where the current regulation that we have in Europe is really, it's a sign of the urgency and really the need for indeed having a proper regulation in, because individually we cannot protect ourselves anymore. So we need to make sure that this is indeed a whole of government, a whole of society approach. And the only way we can do this is indeed also have the lawmakers and policymakers in on it. And that means now we have, unfortunately, to impose some burdens on companies, on enterprises that they should taken on in the first place themselves. So it's really kind of like doing a job that should have sorted itself out long ago, but it hasn't. And now governments have to act. Whether we like it or not, they have to act. And as far as Europe is concerned, there's 3 dimensions to it. So the first one is the operators. So that's the NIS or NIS2 in Europe. Basically, it's saying if you run IT, you have to deal with it. And you have to deal with it properly, because it's not just your problem, it's a society problem. And the second part is producers. So that's the Cyber Resilience Act in Europe. So that's if you produce digital products, then you have to take care of it. That means there needs to be a life cycle behind it. Because, if a car had a major flaw, then you would expect a car maker to take care of it. And rightfully so. So the same thing holds for digital products. So there needs to be a life cycle, patch management, an SBOM, software bill of materials. So these basic things. And then there's what the state needs to do, but maybe we can talk about this a little bit later. There might be another question in play where I can talk about this. But really, we all have a thing to do in this. And the first 2 are really about regulating markets, not because we want to, but because we have to. And here we try, at least we as BSI, we really try to make this as uncomplicated and as little compliance as anyhow possible, because we want people who really understand cybersecurity. There's few enough of them anyhow. We want them to focus on security and not on compliance. So this is where we are as an institution. So we're trying to take the regulation that we have and put it into practical, easy to manage things so that companies and institutions can focus on their cybersecurity, because that's what we all need to do.
Yeah, so those themes around urgency, around the necessity, and around what's at stake really shone through it from what you were saying, and I'm sure we'll come back to those. But Rita, perhaps I can turn to you, because your government passed your legislation back in 2018 and amended it in 2022. So you're a number of years ahead of some of the conversations that we're having. And so I wondered whether or not you could just talk about whether or not you're seeing that as having been sufficient. Has it made a difference to some of those things that Claudia was just talking about? And whether or not you think, given kind of how technology is changing, the threats are changing, do you think it'll be sufficient for the years ahead?
Thanks, John. So I'll give a little bit of context. The legislation you're referring to there is our Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, which is called SOCI. And really, we continue to see the targeting of our critical infrastructure by malicious cyber actors. And then in Australia as well, a lot of our critical infrastructure is privately owned, which also creates a lot of complexities. And really what the SOCI Act it tries to do is to set some of these mandated standards, legal obligations, for any owners or operators of critical infrastructure, and it covers a number of different sectors, including energy, transport, health, etc. Probably good context here as well to maybe explain sort of how we fit into the frameworks. So my agency, we're actually not a regulator. We are the government's technical authority on cybersecurity matters, and really that's how we sort of come into this space, because we work really closely with our colleagues across government who are responsible for these frameworks to ensure that they're really well informed based on what we see in the technical environment. And I guess that's just my way of saying that it's actually a really layered sort of complex environment. Legislation, it's supported by policy frameworks, and it's all sort of underpinned by that threat-informed guidance. And SOCI is a great example of how we've been able to do that previously. So within that SOCI Act, we've got mandatory reporting requirements, which are incredibly important because that gives us incredible visibility into the cyber threat environment. The more reporting we have, the better understanding about the cyber threat environment, the more we can share information with partners, the more mitigations we can provide back into the community. And there was also limited use obligations in there as well, and that was really a later recognition that we needed to try and encourage better communication between victim entities reporting through to government as well. So two very obvious places where we were able to really provide that guidance based on what we understood of the technical environment. I think your question about future-proofing all of this, like all of those elements have to come together. I think it's been said quite a bit. It's not just about the compliance and the accountability, but we always talk about things in the sense of being prepared. And there's one of the key themes I've noticed over the last day is how much people are talking about, we all know the cyber threat environment is incredibly complex. The tech environment as well is evolving. There's so much uncertainty in that, but we always talk about prepare for when a cyber incident is going to happen to you, not just the if. And it's really that kind of proactive preparedness that you start layering into your organisation that I think is actually going to make a remarkable difference moving forward, regardless of sort of the changes in the environment and the complexities that we're facing.
Thank you. So we started with the easy question, where there's a lot of agreement across the panel so far, other than maybe around kind of scope, but I think a lot of kind of commonality between the UK, the EU, Australia. But I thought I'd maybe move on to a subject that sometimes can have a little bit more controversy in the way it's covered, either in the press or the way it's discussed. And that's around kind of foreign ownership, high-risk vendors, and some of the international kind of questions that come out of here. And I think, foreign ownership and investment, global supply chains, the dependence upon foreign technology, they all pose questions when it comes to how do we manage resilience, how do we ensure resilience kind of critical services. We've seen press reporting around Yutong electric buses and the possibility of remote shutdown, for example. But these things tend to kind of generate conversation around how are we balancing risks, how are we balancing the kind of regulatory approach to tackling some of these questions. And so Natalie, I thought I could come to you first, because under the Telecom Security Act, the UK has introduced new approaches to how we manage security risks in that kind of global technology ecosystem. And so from your role as a regulator, where we've already introduced some measures in that way, what are the lessons emerging about how you manage foreign dependency risks in some of the UK's most critical infrastructure, and to do that both effectively and proportionately?
Well, thanks very much, Jonathan. I think I've worked out how this panel is going to go. All the easy questions and then the regulator. So it's always a pleasure to be here. Look, let me give you a sort of practical answer in terms of what we're doing at Ofcom, and then I want to give you a bit of an optimist answer, because I think optimism is important at the moment. So, exactly as you say, Jonathan, under the Telecoms Security Act, Secretary of State at DCIT has the power to designate high-risk vendors and is responsible for the management of that risk, but asks us at Ofcom, through the Telecoms Security Act, to monitor the progress against specific actions that might want to be taken. Now, of course, in the UK, there's one operator that's been designated under HRV. That, of course, is Huawei, and there is a program of work underway that's to be completed by the end of next year, and it's Ofcom's role to monitor that and report to the Secretary of State. I'm going to say something that's very obvious. That has not been an easy process. I was reflecting, I think the last time I was here was about 10 years ago. Don't take that, by the way, as feedback on this conference. I do think this conference is amazing. But I'm pretty sure I was sort of reminiscing. You know, if we think 10 years ago, Cyber UK, Liverpool, this was one of the conversations we were having, actually. How are we going to deal with this issue? And I think what's very impressive about the UK, and I'm slightly biased here, obviously, is that we've gripped it. We have done something about it. It's been very difficult. It's been very expensive. And it's not just about the financial cost, it's also the opportunity cost. You know, it's all the other things we could have been doing as a community when we've been focusing on this. But I think what it's taught us how to do is work together on issues like this, whether you're the government, whether you're the operators, whether you're the regulators, and whether you're the customers, most importantly. And it's forced some difficult conversations about what do we want infrastructure to look like in the UK. And of course, what's the hot topic of the moment? Digital sovereignty. And so I do think that although this process has been challenging, we are coming out in a really good place, and it's positioned us very well to think through those things which really matter in today's world. How do you want to operate your communications infrastructure in particular? Who do you want to do business with? What are you willing to pay for it? But ultimately, how are you held to account? Because I'm afraid we do see market failures. The market is not going to deliver on national security. The market is not going to deliver on economic stability. And that, of course, undermines public confidence. And that's why we do have regulation. I completely agree. It's got to be a last resort. But if you were ever going to use it anywhere, wouldn't you use it in this space?
Thank you. I mean, loads in that. I mean, Claudia, perhaps I can turn to you first, just to build on that. So, you know, European leaders have talked about reducing Europe's reliance on technology from one individual nation or from any one individual nation. So perhaps, I guess, reflecting on what Natalie's just said, from the telecoms perspective, but thinking more broadly, is that realistic? Is it just shifting dependence around? Like, what do you think is actually achievable?
So first of all, I honestly think there aren't any other choices, so we really have to deal with this. So as far as we're concerned as BSI, we try to be indeed very realistic. It's not going to happen overnight. So there's no way we can just say, you know, starting tomorrow, we're going to basically produce everything we need out of Europe ourselves, and we will, you know, cut all ties and do it in our own way. So it's not going to happen. We are dependent, and this is a reality we got to face. So we have dependencies in the cloud sector, in the telecommunication sectors. Not the same players, but nonetheless dependencies. We have a lot of decentralized energy. Well, all those control boxes, all of these units, where do they come from? Satellites. I could, you know, continue the list. One thing that is always very obvious is if you take out your phone, chances are it's going to run on an Android operating system or an iOS. And if you don't like that, well, then you have the alternative of Harmony. Is that going to make it any better? No. So we have dependencies really like all over the place. And what we currently have is a very intense discussion on telecommunications and on cloud services. Those are the two things. But it really, it's a lot more. It's far-reaching, deeply into what we use every day in our technology. I think it's not very realistic to think that we can cut those ties tomorrow, and we wouldn't want to. We want to be able to tap into that ecosystem up to a certain point, but we definitely need to get some control back. We definitely need to get some control back. So that's the one side of things. Use technology from abroad, from outside of Europe, but make sure that you get some control back, especially in the important parts. And the next thing is, we really need to strengthen our own digital industry. I call this the digital GDP. So we really have to raise that. So if you look at the numbers, at least for the European Union, I know them, but anyway, if you look at those numbers, you see that really the part that digital contributes is just way too low. So the digital industry itself. The next part is, how do we use digital? That's, as far as I'm concerned, that's also part of the digital GDP, even though all economics people would tell me this is not really correct. But anyway, for me it makes it quite clear. It's how much we use digital technology in our own productions of non-digital products. Those two things really need to be raised, like severely raised. And when we now talk about AI, when we now talk about mythos, part of the problem is that we do not have our own AI industry, of which we would know that basically it's just a few months behind. We don't. And this is unacceptable. And this is why I also tell politicians they have to face a very sad truth, which is you have to throw a serious amount of money at the problem. It's not going to solve itself. It has to be organized, it has to be orchestrated, so that's part of the job of the state, so I'm 100% with you. But nonetheless, it also needs a lot of investments. And there needs to be a focus on this. If we do not get digitalization and the digital economy really going in Europe, we will face very sad times.
How optimistic are you?
I'm an optimist by nature, so I never give up. I refuse to give up. I refuse to give up. And I do know that we have a ton of really great people who could actually do this. So it's up to us to make sure that they find an environment in which they can thrive. So as far as Europe is concerned, we're talking about capital markets. You know, I'm way out of my league here, you know. I'm an IT person. I do cybersecurity these days, and I'm talking about capital markets. But unfortunately, those two things are interlinked. They do belong together. So we have to make sure that we get the right kind of environment in which digital economy can thrive, because that's going to be important, not just for our economic future, for our defense future, for our security future, but it's also going to be very, very important for our cybersecurity future. That's part of the story.
Before I move us off high-risk vendors and foreign ownership, Rod, perhaps just to come to you with the legislative question is really live in the UK at the moment. So given all of these challenges, given what you've heard, both from the kind of telecom side, what's going on in Europe, should the UK be doing more to address foreign ownership and high-risk vendors in our most critical infrastructure?
Yeah, yes, in a way, and we are through the bill we've got. I mean, one of the things reflecting on that discussion is, well, I think when you go back a few years, this conversation was on you asked about foreign ownership and high-risk vendors. I think we started on high-risk vendors a few years ago, and we were talking about, the powers then that Natalie was referring to in the specific context of Huawei, and again, that phrase of high-risk vendor, so specific factors around a specific company in that field. What Claudia was just talking to there gets us into this broader question here about this isn't about a specific vendor and the specific risk associated with them, but more around that digital sovereignty and what do we think that we need in terms of a much broader capacity within the UK. So when we're looking at things like our legislative powers, and we have been doing a lot on high-risk vendors, so that's in the Telecom Security Act. There'll be national security powers in the Cybersecurity and Resilience Act. We've got the National Security and Investment Act that similarly has that. But also what this says is it's not just about those national security powers. It is about things like investing in onshore capability. And so I think that's where I would point in the UK to, we've just done an announcement on sovereign AI and putting money behind kind of British companies in that field. On cyber, this audience will be well aware that we've been doing things like the Cyber ASAP and Cyber Runway programs for some time. We are looking at how we can kind of move from startup into kind of supporting people in scaling up. So again, actually, my reflection on this conversation is this is quite a broad array of tools that government needs to look at across quite a wide landscape to have the effect we're talking about.
Thank you. A big theme of this conference is about the next 10 years. So I thought I might move to how we keep pace. So around both technology development, but also the agility of regulators and the ability of regulators to kind of move at the same pace as that kind of technology change. So Natalie, perhaps I can come to you first. So tech change is happening at a faster pace than the traditional regulatory kind of cycle. So how can cyber regulation remain effective and relevant in this environment? What has Ofcom learned from the wider context that you're operating in? And is greater flexibility needed to adjust the frameworks given that kind of change of technology?
This is a great question, Jonathan, and it's something we talk about at Ofcom all the time, right? Because we do need to be on our toes. We want to be really careful that we are not regulating for the past. That is in no one's interest. It's a waste of time, effort, and you're losing the commercial edge that you want companies operating in the UK to have. So I think that's a very important starting point. So intellectually, what do you then do? And our approach, for a number of years now, I think consistency has been one of Ofcom's great strengths. We don't surprise people very often, which is this is a good thing for the market. Back to Claudia's point, if you're an investor, you do want consistency. And what we have said for a long time is that we will focus on outcomes, and we are technology neutral. So particularly in the era of AI, where everything is changing so quickly, have seen some of the stuff that AC put out last week in terms of the pace now. You don't want a regulator that's jumping from issue to issue. We stay really, really focused on those outcomes. And although we stay on top of the technology and take those developments very seriously, as much as possible, we try to be neutral. So what does that mean in practice? So, for example, in the Cybersecurity Resilience Bill, it's about recognizing that because the world is moving so quickly, wherever possible, we do want the flexibility, particularly where it comes to scope. So it's been fantastic to see the work that DSIT has done there, that will be coming forward shortly in terms of designations and the issues that we're going to care about. It's also about learning from the past. So yes, we don't want to regulate for the past, but there are important lessons to learn there. And one, for example, is around the importance of the supply chain. We've all been talking about that for 10 years. But in terms of actually having the practical tools to really understand from a regulator's point of view about what is happening in the supply chain, they're not there at the moment, not to the extent that they need to be. And that's one of the questions the Cybersecurity Resilience Bill is going to answer, which again is fantastic news. But most importantly, I actually think it's about one of the big themes of this conference, which always comes through, I think, when you're working with the NCSC, is about partnerships. So this week, I've written to all of the companies that we regulate around Mythos and what we are expecting coming forward, but also emphasizing the point of follow what the NCSC is saying, look at what the AI Security Institute is saying, and talk to us. And ultimately, cybersecurity, particularly in this era, genuinely, it really is a team sport. Literally, no one can do it alone. And so I think that has been a key takeaway from us in terms of particularly the last few weeks, which will set us in a good stead going forward.
Thank you. That's a great answer. And I think that team sport angle is really key to draw out, and a big topic of the conversation at Cyber UK over the last couple of days, particularly given the kind of speed of development around the frontier models that have been in the press quite a lot in the last few weeks. And I think, Rita, perhaps sticking on that topic of kind of technology change, from a defensive perspective, how can AI make a meaningful difference to improving national resilience? And so critically, how do we also factor that into our thinking around regulation? So what is the role of regulation when it comes to AI?
So I think we could probably speak for a very long time about some of the benefits of AI, particularly from a defensive perspective. I'll just cover off on a few because I think everybody's probably got different aspects of this that they look at. From detection and response, I mean, we see AI is able to go through incredibly large quantities of data at a speed and scale that we just aren't able to do so. The behavioural analytics and the pattern identification is incredibly beneficial. Being able to integrate AI into things like software development, going through source code. If you can identify vulnerabilities internally first before somebody does that externally to your organisation, it's also a great defensive benefit. So I think, these benefits go on and on. It's really about the speed and scale. There's also a human element here that comes in with AI as well. If you can, use AI to free up your analysts, your technical experts, your SMEs to work on the things that they only they can intrinsically focus on, that is also potentially a significant force multiplier. And I think everybody probably has resourcing constraints, and that would be a wonderful addition as well. But like anything, you have to be really clear-eyed about the risks. Any new application, software, any kind of changes to your networks. If you're not sort of thinking through those really clearly and you're taking a holistic approach to it, any of that sort of change can introduce vulnerabilities. So I think, we always talk about getting those foundations right. Generally really good cyber hygiene across the board. If you're going to bring a new application into your networks, you've got to make sure you're sitting that on a really nice, solid foundation. So some of those things are really important. We always talk about secure by design, secure by default. Those are the sort of things that organisations need to be looking for. It goes back to a supply chain question as well. I know that we sort of spoke about that a little bit, but AI tools rarely arrive in isolation. There's third-party dependencies, there's components that come in. You have to have a really clear understanding of what you're bringing into your organisation, making really good risk-informed decisions. So I think there's actually a number of different elements that need to come into place. We have been working on sort of providing a lot of updated guidelines on this. I think the challenge here is obviously that we've been talking about how quickly some of these models are evolving and moving forward, and that's where we need to continue to work on putting out that advice so organisations can make really good decisions around those safeguards, and that's the sort of work that we're doing with international partners as well. So it's a constant piece of effort that we need to focus on.
Thank you. So, Claudia, we've talked before about this, but you've got some views about how do we use this to enable kind of defender advantage, but also linking it to the previous question, whose AI should we be relying on as well?
Yeah, well, there's not too many choices, right? So, okay. So indeed, we try to separate the topics a little bit because it usually gets all discussed at the same time. I think it was a CIA guy who once said it's AI for cyber and cyber for AI, and you need to differentiate a little bit between the two. So some of the regulation that we have in place, for example, right now in Europe, they have to do with cyber for AI. So how do you use AI securely? How do you secure an AI in itself so that it can be used securely? So this is the one side of things. You may not like the AI Act. You'll probably profit from being a little bit shortened, but nonetheless, it exists and it's right there. At least in Europe, it's a big issue. But that's really cyber for AI. How do you secure the use and the product itself? And that's a big issue because, as we all know, if you ask in AI the right things, then you can get it to tell you things that you should not be knowing. So this is the one side of things. The other one is, how do we use, indeed, AI for cyber? And here I'm 100% with you. The question really is, who gets to use AI better and faster so that that side's going to win? And it's either going to be the attackers or the defenders. And right now, the attackers are pretty good at using AI. We see this. We see this increasingly, and with the tools that we have these days, this is getting more of an issue. And if we do not manage on the defender side to be at least as fast as the attackers are, well, then we're going to lose that. And they will not stop because, it's just, it's too easy. It pays well. And where they are these days, they really do not have to face any kind of law enforcement or anything like that. So it's not going to stop. It's on us to stop it. And the only way we can do this is if we manage to use those tools and use them effectively and fast. Really, it's all about speed. It's really all about speed. This has to be part of a bigger initiative. This has to be part of how can the state and the agencies that we have, plus partnering with private companies, how can we protect ourselves? And how can we do this at scale and at speed? because those will be the questions that we need to answer, and we need to answer them fast. And when it comes to what kind of AI can we use for this, right now I'd say anything that's available, but it comes at a price, of course. We as a national agency in Germany will not be able to use commercial AI and thus hand over data that is way too sensitive to be just handed over like that. So if other powers want to get at it, they have to work for it. So that's really the point. So therefore, it's crucial that we also have the possibility to use frontier models in such a way that we get back some of that control. So coming to my earlier statement of, if we use technology from abroad, which is totally fine, I'm 100% for it, but then we need to get back a certain level of control. How we're going to enforce this? Well, there's more work to do, I guess. It's going to be painful. I'm with you on this one. But as I said, we also have to build up our own capabilities in order to do this, in order to use AI to automate and build up an effective and automated defense. And this has to be done on a broad scale.
Thank you. Before I kind of finish on AI, Rod, just given the cybersecurity and resilience bill is so live as a conversation at the moment, and given all of the headlines around AI, where's your thinking in terms of the overlaps between what's going on with the bill at the moment, implications for, how do you get assurance, what are we asking for from critical infrastructure, and where's DCIT's thinking?
So, because of the pace at which things move, my sort of approach going into the bill was if the bill is so set in stone that it can't flex around these developments, so the precise development of when they happen and what, say, Mythos' capabilities are not entirely predictable, but the trajectory and the trend we're seeing is. So what we are trying to do with the bill is to incorporate an ability to be flexible around as we see those developments happening. And so, therefore, we have got the ability under kind of secondary powers to be able to change what we're asking, bring additional sectors into scope. So, I think that's my feeling on where we're seeing some of these trends. Is we cannot predict exactly what that might be. So giving ourselves the ability to do that, obviously, without it being so open-ended that you lose the kind of check and balance, what we in the UK call the Henry VIII power, which is effectively where you sort of you lose that, you give government too broader remit without that check and balance. So we've got that in with secondary legislation, but I think that should give us the adaptability we need as these things are changing. It's also not all about the CSRB, of course, as well, and through some of the things that we're doing through codes of practice. And say Cyber Essentials, etc. I think it's about that kind of broad suite of how we can make people resilient to AI-enabled cyber attack as well.
Thank you. I was going to move us just on to touch on regulatory tools, because technology alone cannot create resilience, right? It's also about the regulators, how they act, have they got the tools, the powers, the frameworks they need. And so, Natalie, given your experience in this space, what are the tools that actually drive better security outcomes today? Guidance, standards, incentives, enforcement. But also, crucially, where do they fall short? So do regulators have the right mix of powers, or are there tools missing that can materially improve resilience rather than just focusing on demonstrating compliance?
This is such a good question, and I think it's particularly pertinent in the era of an AI, because it's actually fundamentally challenging how we do business, how we do regulation. So as I said earlier, I think consistency is really important. No one wants a regulator that's unpredictable. So it's interesting being sat in this seat because everyone wants you to adapt and evolve, but also don't change too much that you're going to surprise us. So, I very much agree with the view that you're only doing a good job as a regulator if everyone's not happy with you. So long may that live on. But for us, I think there's sort of three tests. One, it's around, do companies really understand what we are asking of them? It's not fair to hold companies to account if you're not being clear and transparent and predictable about what you are expecting. So we invest a lot of time and effort in trying to make sure that that is the case, but of course being really open to feedback because we're all learning, right? Particularly, I think, in the cyberspace. This is all new, we're all finding our way, things are moving so quickly. So having that open dialogue, but having very transparent guidance of what is expected and then clear standards is very, very important. But maybe to say something a bit different in terms of what you might not be expecting, I also think that there is a strong role for regulators to enable innovation. For those of you that followed the AI Opportunities Plan, there is actually now a requirement on regulators to enable the adoption of AI in the sectors that they regulate. And we take that incredibly seriously, particularly in cyber, because exactly as Richard Horton said yesterday, we're at a moment of time where you've got an opportunity where it's all about defense, or it's also about offense, and being in the space where we can try and be on the front foot and make sure that we are there making the most of the opportunities on AI on the side of the angels, as it were. So we take that role really seriously. We have a consultation out at the moment about the role of AI in telecoms, for example, and working out how can we support companies in this space, because we want the UK to be the best place to come and work with the regulator to help you deploy AI in your company. And then the third point is actually it's an internal-looking one. I know lots of you will have feedback for us around how much paperwork there is, the processes, the time, and all I can say is I hear you. I really hear you. And we're trying to learn ourselves. How can we use AI as a tool to improve regulation in terms of how we do our jobs, to make it as efficient and as effective as possible, but at the same time still hold us to those gold standard level, which the UK is known, right? We are known for our trusted regulation. So walking this tightrope at the moment is not easy as a regulator. It makes it very, very interesting, but it is challenging. And so I don't think it's a question anymore of being able to say, this guidance is good, these standards are bad. It's actually a bit more developed in terms of what do you want your system to look like, how do you work with others to deliver that, and how do you make sure that you're responding to feedback while still maintaining the certainty that everyone wants to see.
Thank you. Loads in that. I was going to move us on to response and recovery, because even with the strongest regulation, some attacks will inevitably succeed. But this also, I guess, falls into overlaps a little bit with the last question. So I might start with you, Natalie, on this one as well, which is, what role should regulation play in ensuring that organizations can recover realistically from major incidents without creating expectations that can't be achieved?
Look, so at the end of the day, it's always better to prevent rather than have to respond. But we all know that it's impossible to have that true 100% of the time. So I think there is a really important role for the regulator to send really clear signals at a board level around expectations that when things do go wrong, you recover as quickly as possible in a way that engages consumers in particular. We obviously regulate a wide range of different companies. Under the TSA and the NIS, we regulate about 50 companies on a very, very active basis, from your smallest altnet to your biggest multi-billion, multi-geographic company. And there's a common thread in terms of when things go wrong. And more often than not, it's poor communication at a board level. So for whatever reason, everyone wasn't in the loop. They didn't really understand how big this issue, and that's a failure within the company which needs to be dealt with quickly. But also, they don't communicate with their consumers and their customers. And that is where, particularly from a regulator's point of view, we will be really, really strong in terms of the harm that has been caused to consumers and customers, and then not helping them at that moment when they can be most vulnerable. Yeah. And it's particularly important in the communications space because obviously you can very quickly end up in a threat to life situation if you can't get hold of 999. We fined BT £17.5 million because there was not continual access to 999 for 10 hours and for 1 hour complete non-access. That's the extreme end. That's actually not the world that we want to be in terms of issuing fines. Before you get there, you want to be in a place where the board is taking these issues very, very seriously, and when something happens, there's excellent communication at that level, but most importantly, with the people that are affected.
Thank you. That's a really good example of powers being used by a regulator, and granted by legislation within in government. But Rita, can I turn to you with the Australian example, where your legislation includes a direction power that can be used in extreme circumstances. I wonder if you could just explain a little bit about that, but also why it's never been used.
Okay. Yeah, so again, this relates back to that act that I was referring to earlier, and you're right, for us, this is a very extreme circumstance where it would be utilised. We see this as an absolute last resort, but essentially it exists for the instances where there is an incredibly serious cybersecurity incident impacting Australia that has the potential to have a national level consequence. And in those particular circumstances, the Act allows us to undertake a certain amount of activity, and that includes providing guidance to a critical infrastructure provider, directing action, and as you mentioned, there's this intervention element as well. But that intervention element is all about being able to secure services, restore, get things back up and running as quickly as possible. For us, the threshold here is set deliberately really high. It is always our intention to work with a provider, with critical infrastructure, with one of our partners, as opposed to having to use this measure. So having the power, though, is actually really critical. It prepares us for those very worst case scenarios. The success here isn't about the fact that the power is actually used. The fact it hasn't been used is good. But we do need to have something like this available because it does provide us that assurance that if we do have one of those worst case scenarios, we have the ability to act. And sometimes being able to step in and take really decisive, quick action, that can really impact the severity and the scale of an incident. So that's really what that's for.
I like that success is the power not being used in many ways, which I think we've got 2 or 3 minutes left at the end of this panel, and so I did want to just focus a little bit on what success looks like. So, we talked a lot about the outcomes. We want to drive better resilience, but there's a clear sense of urgency in terms of how we need to drive those outcomes. How do we measure success or failure when it comes to regulation? Not least because, as you said at the very beginning, Claudia, that it really is a last resort measure. So it's really important that we know whether or not it has been successful or not. So, Natalie, perhaps I can start with the regulator in this case rather than starting with the cyber agencies. In 5 years' time, how will we know if it hasn't worked? What will we be regretting at Cyber UK, 2031? So, if you can start us off.
I feel like that's a bit of a negative there, Jonathan. What would have gone wrong because you, regulator, haven't done what was required? Look, let me first say the obvious thing that you would expect me to say, and then let's unpack this. We've got to be very careful about the weight that we put on regulation. It is not a silver bullet. It does not solve all problems. And in a complex world, sometimes it can be a knee-jerk, easy reaction, we'll regulate for that. But as you've heard, it's complex, it's costly on a whole range of issues, and quickly it can feel quite outdated in a world that's moving so fast. But for me, I think it's more around, more broadly, the aim should be to deregulate wherever possible, right? We should put ourselves out of a job. That is a good outcome. The challenge is, I regulate across communications infrastructure, so from competition to national security to a whole range of other issues, including on the consumer side. Out of all the areas I'm responsible for, of course it feels that national security is where that's going to be hardest to do because it is so important. So I think good looks like to me a world where we feel as agile as possible, as proportionate as possible, and we continue to be as transparent as possible. So we retain that public confidence. And the good thing about that is those are commitments today. So it sort of goes back to my earlier question. The outcomes that we want today are probably going to be the same outcomes that we want in 10 years' time. It's just the journey is much faster than anyone expected in terms of how we are adopting change and how we are having to respond to it. And there's so much uncertainty thrown at us. But that's where regulation can be helpful in terms of consistency, proportionality, and transparency. So, as I say, at the end of the day, it does not solve all problems, but I think particularly in the world of security and resilience, it has a very, very special role to play.
Thank you. Claudia, I saw lots of nodding as Natalie was talking.
Yeah.
So how will we know if we've been successful at the speed necessary?
At the end of the day, indeed, it's all about did we have the right kind of impact? And the only way we can measure this is, has our world gotten better? And we measure this, of course, in how many attacks are there, how severe are they, how successful are they, what kind of economic impact do they have, how much data do we lose? So we've got a ton of data how we measure this. We're still trying to bake this into some kind of one single number, but we'll see about that. But on the individual level of each and every regulation, you have to, of course, drill down a little bit more. So when it comes to the NIS2, for example, where we look at the operators, we would look towards where are they in their maturity level. And this is something you can measure. You can actually measure how far did they progress. And so for this one, this would be the KPI. For other regulations, it would be another kind of KPI.
Rod, final word to you on Cybersecurity Resilience Bill. How will we know it's been a success?
What a success. So 5 years is an intimidatingly long time in this world. For me, it's that agility point. If we are finding that we are able to use the powers that we've been given to continue to adapt, and that we are still talking about using this piece of legislation we are introducing now to be able to deal with the problems of 2031, then it would have been a highly successful bill. If I am instead bringing forward CSRB2 in primary legislation, that probably suggests we didn't give it the adaptability that we need, because we've got to go at a pace faster than often primary legislation lets us do. But I caveat all of that 5 years is frighteningly long.
Thank you very much indeed. That draws to an end our panel today, so thank you for joining us, whether or not it's in person or online. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel for sharing their wisdom.